Okay, I think we can get started. Thank you so much for joining me. I have to admit I am a newbie to Wardley mapping. I've been wanting to learn more about it for a while. But as you may know, Simon and Dave Snowden have done several events together, and so there's definitely a link between complexity thinking, Cynefin, and Wardley mapping. Tonight, I'm not really going to go into Cynefin so much. I want to explore some of the habits of mind, or let's call them ways of being, that we need to adopt to be able to function in uncertainty. Or as Holger, rightly said when we spoke before the time, how do we operate on the left-hand side of the map? So I'm going to chat to you about some pioneering habits of mind. And I think one of the, I don't know if we can call it a gift necessarily, but one of the things that COVID-19 has done is it has given all of us let's call it a masterclass in uncertainty. It's shown us just how interconnected the world is, and it's challenging some really deep-seated unconscious beliefs. And I have to admit, even, I've been working in the field of complexity and uncertainty for nearly 2 decades. And I was surprised just by how deeply seated some of these beliefs are. And one primary one that I've been really interested in and that I've been challenged by is realizing how much we've been indoctrinated in a way to see stability and certainty as normal, and periods of instability and uncertainty as abnormal, and it's supposed to be transient. So it needs to be temporary. So kind of when things become uncertain, we think it will pass. It's like, if you look at the image that I used in this slide, it's almost like we believe that the mist will clear and the road will appear again. And it might look a bit different. We hear people talking now about the new normal. And in that, there's this belief that the new normal might look different, but it will be a new stability. And I think what we're starting to realize now is that these last few decades of stability, that is what was abnormal. And uncertainty is the normal. And that is really difficult, I think, for us to deal with, because we are used to dealing with short-term periods of uncertainty, but dealing with perpetual uncertainty that won't necessarily end, that creates a lot of anxiety. And so what I'm seeing, just in the consulting that I do in my clients, is the sense of people feeling completely unmoored. It's like they've lost their bearings. There's no more stable ground for them to stand on. And on the one hand, that generates a lot of anxiety, but on the other hand, that's more or less where I think pioneers come into their own, and where pioneering is what we need to do. So in a way, we are in complete uncharted territory. And I have a friend who is in the system psychodynamic space. And one of the things that he said that I really loved is that those who will thrive in the future are the ones who are able to turn anxiety into creative energy. And this, I think, is the space of the pioneers. This is where we are in this uncharted territory, and in the same way that it's anxiety provoking, there are also so many options that we can explore. But one of the ways that I believe that you can turn this anxiety into creative energy is by really understanding complexity, how it's different from order, and how we therefore need to be acting and thinking in very different ways. So maybe just very quickly, I know that many of you have already come across complexity, so I'm not going to go into it too much, but one of the things that I think we really need to understand is that complexity arises from the connections between things. So it's and therefore, the more connected the world becomes, the more complex. And the more complex the world becomes, the more uncertain. And so it's important for us to start understanding how things are connected, how things are flowing between those connections, not necessarily understanding the things themselves. You would have heard by, I'm sure you're very familiar with the acronym VUCA. I think it's very overused. And what I find really interesting is that it's not new. VUCA, kind of came about in the armed forces in the 80s, but it's become very fashionable of late. And I think it's because it's become our lived experience, and the volatility, uncertainty, and ambiguity in that acronym, I believe, is driven by the complexity. It's driven by the sea. And when many people ask me, is the world becoming more complex? And sometimes it's a bit of a difficult question to answer, because I think it's always been complex. But the more connected we become, and Simon referred to this as well, when we have new technologies emerging and new ways to communicate, the way that we organize changes. And I think that the hyperconnectivity that we're experiencing now and the rise, they are creating a more complex environment. And I think one of the things that, just to normalize complexity a bit, because I think sometimes we forget that we already know how to navigate complexity. If you've ever been, if you've ever driven, if you've ever been in traffic, if you've ever used public transport, or even if you've just had dinner with friends, or you've been in some kind of social context, you have navigated complexity. I think the problem is that we forget those skills when we enter the workplace. It's like when we step over the threshold of our work environments, we suddenly imagine ourselves to be in this wonderfully ordered environment where we can predict, where we can have 5-year plans, and where we can, in a way, tame complexity. I'm always quite amused. I don't know if you guys have noticed, but in the last couple of years, complexity has become more of a mainstream topic. So, for example, the Harvard Business Review have published several articles. But very often when they do write about complexity, they've got another word like simplify, or one that I saw quite recently was around taming complexity. And I think what's really important for us to understand is that complexity can't be tamed, it can't be wished away, and it can't be simplified. And it's not good or bad, it just is. And if you think about just the natural environment, any social context, any human context is complex. And we've all experienced those, and we all know how to navigate it. The problem is, as Diego Espinosa says, we have outsourced our relationship with uncertainty to certainty merchants. And you'll see there that the images that I chose there is of the weather. So I studied meteorology in what seems like a completely different lifetime ago. And I find it interesting how even our relationship with the natural world, our relationship with weather, we want things to be predictable. We want somebody to tell us what the weather will look like tomorrow. We don't want to be open to surprise or open to contingency. And we've essentially created this disintermediation or disintermediated relationship with uncertainty. I do a lot of work, for example, in the insurance industry. And that is an industry essentially built around being certainty merchants. When you buy a life insurance policy, when you buy a retirement annuity, for example, what you're essentially trying to buy is certainty. And I think a lot of the pressure that comes, especially on leaders, is when the people or their people, their followers, are expecting them to essentially be a certainty merchant. I think the rise of or our addiction in a way to having clear goals and clear strategies to a large extent is driven by this need for certainty. We want to know what is coming next. And this is one of the things that I believe is we need to recultivate our relationship with uncertainty. Last year, I had the privilege of attending a conference in DC where Alicia Juarero was one of the speakers. And one of the things that she said is if collectively as human beings, we don't build more of a capability to be in uncertainty, it is really frightening, because that means that anyone that promises certainty will always have a following. And if you look at what's going on in the world at the moment, if you look at the rise of populism and the kinds of leaders that people are electing, you can see the ones who are able to promise certainty, or the ones who are trying to promise certainty, are not the kind of leaders that we need in the world right now. So this is a really important point for me, not only in this context of Wardley mapping and pioneering in business, but in general. I think we really need to think differently, and we need to be differently in the world, and embrace uncertainty. And for this, I really like what Edgar Morin wrote. And he said we need to go beyond an intellectual understanding of complexity to an lived complexity. And I think this is something that I see a lot, especially now post-pandemic. Before, a couple of years ago, you felt a bit like Chicken Little when you were telling executives that the world is complex, there's uncertainty, they need to have adaptive strategies, etc. It's like, understood it cognitively, but it didn't change any of their behaviors. And it's almost as if the certainty that they still had superseded this cognitive realization that there is uncertainty and complexity in their contexts. And I think what the pandemic has done now is it has completely shaken those beliefs, and everybody now suddenly is able to see the uncertainty. The problem is we're not entirely sure how to be in it. So a couple of years ago, I had the privilege of co-authoring an article with a bunch of physical scientists. They are ecosystem scientists, and they wanted to explore what do we need to do to create what they used to call complexity mindset within the research and the ecosystem management community. And as part of that process, we came up with a couple of habits of mind, and I thought I want to share those with you tonight, because a lot has been said about the methods and the tools. It's quite easy to teach someone, for example, how to use the Cynefin framework. It's easy to teach the theory around complexity. But this embodied or lived complexity is not so easy, and I think it's really important. So what are these 3 habits of mind? The first one is to embrace messiness. Dave Snowden has been talking a lot recently about the idea of entanglement. I find it quite useful to just go to the root word of complexity. So complicated, the plic in complicated means folded. So I can unfold something that is complicated. I can fully understand it. I can refold it. And then I can replicate those folds, even if it's a very complicated fold like an origami fold. Complex systems are tangled. I try to show that with this image that's on screen. If I try and untangle that bird's nest, I'm going to destroy it. So we really need to start embracing messiness, and that entails considering these dynamic connections and flows between things. And if you remember, I said in the beginning, complexity arises from the interconnections between things. And we tend to study the things themselves. In organizations, for example, there's a huge focus when it comes to change and, changing culture or whatever it is that we need to change. There's a huge focus on training individuals and trying to change the behavior of individuals, rather than thinking about, for example, what the interactions look like between people. How do I change the nature and the quality of those interactions? Who is proximate to who? How are things flowing? And it's very messy. It's not so easy to think in terms of how things are connected versus just thinking about, categories of things. But it's really important. And I think another really important thing is that we need to understand that because of this messiness and because complex systems are connected in nonlinear ways, in ways that we can't necessarily see and we can't fully understand, whatever we do, there will be unintended consequences. And one of the things that we need to understand is that we are responsible for those unintended consequences. So when we're in as many of you know, Dave has been talking about this idea of we need to think about safe to fail. We need to think of small local interactions with the system rather than really big system-wide interventions. And one of the reasons why we do this is that should unintended consequences arise, then they are much easier to disrupt when they are small. I think whenever, especially in a culture, when we want to change culture organizations, we want to go with these really big interventions. And those very often they don't work. And sometimes they create consequences that is really difficult to roll back from. So we need to consider the connections. We need to understand that there will always be unintended consequences. And then another really interesting one is we need to stop striving for consensus. In many of, especially the executive teams I work in, this need for consensus very, very often just grinds the entire system to a standstill. It creates so much inertia because when we're dealing with a truly, everyone or many people will have different, sometimes contradictory hypotheses, and they will all have valid evidence for those hypotheses. That is the nature of a complex system. Dave often says one of the heuristics to know if you're in complexity or not is that the available evidence will support multiple competing hypotheses. So if you are driving for consensus, and another word that I've really come to dislike in organizations is alignment. I think alignment, it's used in virtually every meeting. It is, some of the, especially HR practitioners and managers, it's one of their favorite words. And I think it's become a euphemism for agreement. So this drive for consensus and alignment very often removes the ambiguity and the necessary diversity that we need when we're dealing with complexity. It's essentially a way for us to try and get rid of the messiness. So this is very often, it creates a bit of an allergic reaction when speaking to leaders in particular, because we've been taught that consensus is how you make decisions and alignment is how you get everybody aligned behind your values, around your goals. And in complexity, that simply strips away some of your resilience. So embracing messiness is one of the first habits of mind that's needed in uncertainty. Then the second one, closely related, and these are all very closely related and interconnection, is to cultivate openness. And I just chose 3 for each of these, but there are so many. Openness is a stance. It's a way of being in the world. And one of the things that you need to become open to is to be in questions, to stay in the question, to stay in the discomfort of not knowing. One of the organizing principles in Cynefin is to avoid premature convergence. And I think one of the things that really counts against us when we're in uncertainty and when we're in that pioneering space is to converge too quickly on what we think the problem is, and then from there to converge too quickly to a solution. So one of the things that I've learned, or that I'm trying to learn, not fall into a problem solution mindset, but to start looking for patterns and to try and sit in the question and sit in the messiness. There's a new book out now where they talk about staying in the trouble, to sit in that question and actually to value the question just for the question's sake. In complexity, answers are transient, questions remain. And I think where the discomfort comes from very often is when we're in uncertainty, what happens is we're constantly on the boundary of knowing and not knowing, and of competence and incompetence. And this creates a lot of anxiety for us because many of us have grown up in environments where knowing is what is valued. You know, many of us, especially people in leadership positions, their sense of identity in a way comes from knowing and having answers. And to be in a space where you can't know, where nobody can know, creates a lot of anxiety for people. So one of the first things that I normally do is to normalize this. It's not that you have suddenly become incompetent. It is that the environment is such, the context is such that nobody can know. Then I think the second one is to cultivate an openness to diversity. So as from South Africa, and in South Africa, as I think in many other areas in the world now, diversity has become quite a loaded word. In South Africa in particular, we've got many laws and governing processes diversity into workplaces, and it's become a bit of a quota management system. Whereas I think if you look at diversity through the lens of complexity, you realize that it's not a problem to solve, it is a strategic asset to nurture. And the thing is that we are also focused very shallowly on so we tend to think of things like gender and race, etc. But where diversity is really important, as well as cognitive diversity, we need people who see the world radically differently. And in many of our organizations, in our striving for, in many of the cultures that I work in, when they say they want to change their culture, one of the first things they do is they say, we want to have one culture. So I don't want to name names, but, it's like almost every single organization where I've worked, they would say, we are driving towards having one, whatever the bank's name is, or, one BP, for example, or one Shell. This is really damaging because, well, on the one hand, you can never have a singular culture. But even if that should happen, then immediately you've stripped away all of your adaptive capacity and your resilience. So we really need to start valuing diversity, and this is really difficult. I think many HR practitioners would tell you that they've been told we need to hire people who think differently, and those people who think differently don't survive for very long. And I don't know, for those of you who watch Star Trek, they get assimilated by the Borg, or they leave. And so we really need to, how do we truly value diversity, and how do we really become open to these diverse perspectives and hold our own strong opinions lightly? And then the final one is we need to become open to serendipity and emergence. It's really interesting when I work with teams nowadays, one of the things that they lament about this new way of working is that they no longer have these serendipitous encounters with others. One of the things I like about this particular platform is that they try, or they seem to be trying to simulate in a way these serendipitous encounters, where you just run into somebody by accident and have an interesting conversation, and from there, interesting new ideas emerge, or your network immediately changes when you have these serendipitous conversations. So things emerge, if you think, many innovations have come about through serendipity and emergence. It's not through planned encounters. So how strategies where we manage for serendipity? How do we create environments? What does it mean? So before we all ended up in this virtual space, a lot of my work involved working with my clients to help them understand that the contexts that they design enable the emergence of the culture and the behavior that they need. One of the metaphors I love to use is it's hard to survive in the jungle if you're trained in the zoo. Or put slightly differently, it's hard to respond to a jungle if you're structured like a zoo. And sometimes these zoos are in our minds, they're not only in the environment, but we need to start thinking about how we become open to serendipity and emergence ourselves, but then also how we create environments where we encourage this openness and where we actually create the conditions where more of it can happen. And then the last one, sometimes the most difficult one of all, is we need to learn how to discern time and timing. I think we live in a world where, especially, with the agile movement, where speed has almost become a goal in itself, an objective in itself. It's going faster and faster seems to be what everyone is trying to do. And in complexity, going faster is not always the right thing. Sometimes we can go faster in the completely wrong direction. So time and timing, and if you think about time as a constraint in itself, sometimes there's a time to act and there's a time to wait. One of the things that I see a lot of in organizations as well is continuous restructuring. So change on change, we keep, whenever a new leader starts, he restructures, or, it seems to be our intervention of choice. And the problem is that we don't even give the last restructuring the time that it needs to have any kind of an impact, and then we are restructuring again. Going back to the first habit of mind of embracing messiness, sometimes we act too quickly. Sometimes the right thing that we need to do is to wait. We need to, it's almost as if we are sowing seeds all over the place and then we don't give them the chance to germinate. So how do we discern when we have to act? Because for those of you who know Cynefin, if we are chaotic domain of Cynefin, we have to act. There, the wrong thing to do is to wait. But other times, if we're too fast, it's almost like a knee-jerk, and we need to wait. We need to wait so that the seeds we've sown can germinate. We need to wait so that we can see what is emerging. So some of the best pioneers that I know see the space, and then they wait to see what emerges. They don't act too quickly. So I think that is one of the things, to know when to act and to know when to wait. Then to know when to go fast and when to go slow. One of my favorite authors in complexity is Professor Paul Sillier. He was based here in South Africa. He died way too young, but he was one of the world-renowned thinkers in complexity. And he used the metaphor or the analogy of a stew. You need to cook it really slow and really long so that it can get tender. When you're cooking a stew, it needs to be very fast and very hot. But there's no one speed that fits everything. And I think some into is almost this red where we're just going faster and faster and faster just to, stay in the same place, or now even going backwards. Harold, the author is Paul Sillier. I'll type it for you. I think it's spelled a bit differently or pronounced a bit differently in French. So yeah, this notion of speed, I think even now, so we're here in South Africa, we are in lockdown still. We've been for several months. And it's been really interesting to just see what's happening with time. It's as if time boundaries have just completely disappeared. On the one hand, every day flows into the next so that I almost can't remember what day of the week it is. And on the other hand, it feels like everything has sped up. I'm essentially sitting, behind Zoom every day, the whole day. And this notion of time, I think, is becoming more and more important because we need to understand that time is created equal, let me put it that way. Again, Alicia Guerrero, she spoke at the same conference that I spoke about earlier. She spoke about different kinds of time. So there is chronos time, which is the chronological time that we're all very familiar with. It's the time of our calendars. And that is the time that we are trying so hard to speed up. We want to all go faster than our competitors. You know, people who misinterpret Boyd's OODA loop, you know, think that that's also going faster. So you have to get inside your opponent's OODA loop. You know, we've got all of these things encouraging us to go faster in chronos time, but then of kairos time, which is where it's almost, I think you can say it's the opportune time. It's when time and context come together. So it's opportune time for something. And I think what's happening is we are missing some of these kairos moments where there's an opportune time for us to take a particular option or to bring a particular product to market, or there's an opportunity missing because we are just focusing on speeding up in chronos time. So I think time is something that we really need to get a on. And then the last one is there's a time to keep going and there's a time to let go. Henry Cloud wrote a book called Necessary Endings. And I think very often what happens is we get so invested, you know, even in some of our experiments or in a particular direction that we're exploring into. You know, in many organizations, you know, you will hear them talk about large projects that have become too big to fail. It's almost, we get to a point where we've invested so much into something that we actually letting it go. And when the context shifts, some of our projects, business units, some of our relationships, some of the methods that we love, you know, many things become irrelevant and we actually need to stop doing them. We need to let go. And this is really, really difficult because, you know, in many of the organizations where I'm working now, what I'm seeing is that the level of uncertainty is creating a very particular form of inertia where senior leaders don't want to make decisions. They don't want to prioritize. So instead of saying, look, we're going to focus on this particular area or we're going to go into this particular direction, units or these areas that's no longer profitable or that, you know, that's kind of dragging us down, we're going to just stop doing those things. They hedge their bets and they want to do everything. And so I think this idea of letting go, Henry Cloud uses the analogy of pruning. And so I don't know how many of you have roses or fruit trees, but you know, when you prune a plant, sometimes away branches, sometimes you're cutting away, you know, these water shoots that kind of pull the energy and the nutrients away from the branches that you wanted to bear fruit. And those are easy to prune. But sometimes what you need to do is to prune branches that are already budding, where there are already flowers or you know, the buds of fruit starting to form, because you need to direct the energy into another branch. You need to, you know, to get a proper harvest, you need to not divert the nutrients in too many different directions. And this letting go, I think, is one of the most difficult things for people to do, to be able to do. And so I've got one last slide, and I wanted to share this with you. It's one of my favorite poems. And I think this just summarizes where I think we are, and both the opportunity and what is making us feel so anxious. So, traveler, your footprints are the path and nothing more. The path is made by walking. And by walking, the path is made, and when you look back, you'll see a road never to be taken. Traveler, there is no path, only trails across the sea. And I really love this poem because I think there is so much opportunity now for us to not necessarily be wayfinders, but to be way makers. to really step into that space on the left-hand side of Simon's maps, and to step into that pioneering spirit. But I think we need to understand that for some it's really exciting, and for others it's really anxiety provoking. And I think some of what we need to do as thinking partners is to help people contain that anxiety and turn it into creative energy.